Because of the brutal and Nazi-like actions of some of the police force last Thursday and Friday,
into the mic, Brent.
I am no longer able to pursue the moderate approach. Where are your priorities? People of Toronto need protection, not harassment. We tell you to get out of our clubs, get out of our homes, and get out of our bedrooms and get back to fighting the crime on the street. We're angry because of your lack of sensitivity. There was obviously no attempt by the officers in charge of the raid to require restraint on the part of the raiding policemen. The newspapers reported that most of the officers were given absolutely no instructions in advance. The resulting rampage of unnecessary destruction and verbal abuse by the police was therefore supported by the officers in charge. You may respond by saying, well, why don't you go lay a complaint? Well, why should we lay a complaint? We've seen in the past, and the black community have seen in the past, that when we go to lay a complaint, what usually happens is the complainant is charged with something, or their home is raided.
I want to begin as Susan began and make sure that you know that I do not speak for all Christians. I wish I could. But seriously, though, I want to make sure we have the context for what it was like at the time that the Bath raids happened. We had no human rights protections. People could be fired from their jobs, denied services, and regularly were. People were afraid of the police after demonstrations. When the demonstrations of various types would break up, we'd say to people, leave in groups so that the gay bashers or the police don't beat you up. And often when the parks were raided or different arrests were made, the media would publish the names and people would lose their jobs or commit suicide. So that's the kind of atmosphere we were in, and the baths were an important, valued institution in our community. There were more and more baths being opened, and hundreds of men on a regular basis would go to the baths to be able to find sex and be able to find companionship, and those who didn't go to the baths, I think in general, recognized their value as an important institution in our community. So I was asked what motivated me to get involved around the Bath raids, and I think the answer is both political and pastoral. It's pastoral because everyone seemed to know someone who was arrested. Everyone seemed to know someone who was traumatized that night, who was in fear of their name being published, who were in fear of having a criminal record. And so people were angry not just because an institution was attacked, but they were angry because their friends were attacked. It's been my experience that most of the resistance to LGBT human rights is religious-based. And a religious attack always requires a religious response. So I thought it was very important for our church to be involved and to be upfront in the response to the Bath raids. We have had a history of it. When Anita Bryant came to Toronto in the late 70s, we organized a service in response in opposition to her presence here. When the bill to include sexual orientation was introduced in 1981 in the legislature, we knew it was going to be defeated because of the majority conservative government. So 3 of us were trained in civil disobedience, and we got some handcuffs and snuck them into the legislature and demonstrated. I didn't own any handcuffs at the time. I had to buy some. And we chained ourselves to the railing and disrupted the legislature. The bill didn't pass that time, but it did the next time around. So activism is a very valuable and important tool for religious institutions as well to use. And our church was founded on spirituality, social justice, and community. After the Bath raids, the protests were becoming more and more violent, and I was concerned about that violence. In one of the demonstrations, the police were clearing the streets, and an elderly gay man fell down, and the police were kicking him. And so I jumped in and grabbed him and pulled him out, and 2 police officers held me while the 3rd one beat me. The violence was getting more and more severe. And so I decided to go on a hunger strike to demand an investigation into the police activity. And I went on a water-only hunger strike for 25 days. There was no response from the majority conservative government at the time of the province. But a city councillor, Gordon Cressy, organized a motion to be passed at city council to end my hunger strike. One of the Toronto newspapers editorialized, "Let him starve." The next day, after the city set aside $90,000 for the investigation, they said it was the most expensive meal in the history of the city of Toronto. The city hired a human rights reporter named Arnold Bruner, and he interviewed the police. He interviewed a number of leaders of the gay lesbian community about what our concerns around the police were. And he produced the Bruner report, which had 14 recommendations, giving us practically everything that we asked for, from the police publicly saying that the gay community, gay lesbian community were a legitimate part of the community, to sensitivity training, to liaison committees, etc. Now, it took us 25 years to get them to implement all the recommendations, but we did. But it was also a pastoral issue because it was important for us to be standing up not just to protect an institution, but to protect individuals. People had been traumatized. And I thought it was important that they see that the church was standing up for them and on behalf of their defense. Many of the people arrested were extremely closeted. One of the women in our church at the time worked in the Attorney General's office for the province of Ontario, and 2 of her staff were arrested that night. And there were demands that she fire them, and she refused to fire them because they were arrested. But for many others, it was a very, very, very difficult time. So we've used a variety of tactics over the years in fighting for human rights issues, and I know it's a bit risky, but I want to name that I've always seen that the most success we make is when we have both people on the inside negotiating and people on the outside demonstrating, and that we have a mutual respect for each other, that we don't badmouth the ones who are on the inside trying to negotiate for some kind of change, and we don't badmouth the people on the outside who are being more radical. Because when I've been on the inside, they never would have listened to me if there weren't people on the outside protesting. And when I've been on... And when I've been on the outside of the barricades yelling, we probably wouldn't have gotten any progress if there wasn't somebody else on the inside trying to negotiate change. My experience has been all human rights gains are incremental. We hardly ever get everything at once, but we get something and build on it and build on it and build on it until ultimately we have the human rights that we are trying for. So tonight I'd really like for you to, for those of you who weren't around at the time, just to remember how scary it was, how traumatic an experience it was to have our institutions attacked so violently and so many people arrested. And at the same time, just sense of how exhilarating it was for all of these people who had never been activists before to come out on the street. For some of us, we had to, we were so prim and proper in those days, we couldn't say no more shit. We just had to mimic the words. Or, fuck you, 52. I couldn't quite say it that way in public. But it was an exhilarating time because you may not have been born in 1981, but a movement in this city was born that continued and continued and continued. And there are 70 countries in the world where every single person in this room would be arrested simply for coming to a talk like this, an issue like this. So while we have a lot more work to do in this city and in this country, we also have a lot of work to do around the world, because what happened in Toronto in '81 is still happening all over the world, and people aren't able to come together in some places to talk about it, and we have a responsibility for them too. Thank you.